How can vegetable oils kill you? Well, actually, in quite a few ways, and I'm just going to talk about one of the best known ways today. Why would anyone want to do that? Economics. Food manufacturers have learned how to genetically modify crops to resist a herbicide. The idea is you would add the herbicide to the crop, the weeds would die, but the genetically modified organism would not. And so it can grow more freely. It can be produced on a huge scale. For instance, a popular crop is corn. In a recent video, I went over the ways corn can be processed to extract corn starch. The corn starch can be modified by hydrolysis to give glucose, but that's not so good because glucose isn't very sweet. So an enzyme can take glucose to fructose. Now you're talking. Fructose is 1.6 or 1.7 times as sweet as sugar. So this mixture of glucose, 0.7 times as sweet as sugar, and fructose, much sweeter, gives you fructose corn syrup. Because the enzymes are readily available, the glycosidase and the isomerase necessary to do this are thermostable. They can be heated up. Fructose corn syrup is produced on a megaton scale and shipped all over the country. Obviously, consumption of fructose corn syrup is bad for you. I routinely screen labels now, and I don't take any food that contains fructose corn syrup. But I'm talking today about processed oils and fats. It's the same outline. Crops like rapeseed, canola can be GMO modified. Soy can be GMO modified. They can be produced without weeds, huge scale, and the food manufacturers can create megatons of seeds. Now, what are they going to do with these seeds? Well, they might produce sunflower seeds, saffron oil, soy oil, canola oil, substances like this. I will talk about one well-known way these can kill you, but there are others, and I plan more videos on this subject. I'm sorry, I'm a chemistry professor. I have to give you a little bit of chemistry for you to understand what's going on here. When a patient goes to the doctor might routinely check for triglycerides. Triglycerides are one of 4 or 5 categories of a bigger class called lipids. Characteristic of triglycerides is a core formed from this trialcohol, glycerol. Onto the glycerol is merged 3 long fatty acids. There are a range of triglycerides, and these fatty acids can be varied. They can be mixed and matched to give ones of different compositions. Those fatty acids can be all the same. They can be 2 the same, 1 different, or 3 can be different. Some fatty acids have double bonds in them, alkenes. You remember? Alkenes are CC with 2 bonds between them. And if those alkenes are cis, then the chain must kink because of the geometry of the alkene. Foods are not pure substances, but they predominate in some things. So some triglycerides are solids, like butter or coconut oil. And they're solids because they don't have double bonds in the chains, or predominantly they are just saturated, we call them. So when we refer to saturated fats, which are not particularly bad for you, these are comprised of hydrocarbon chains, mostly with no double bond. A little bit of a chemistry lesson. If 2 substituents are on the same side of a double bond, that's cis. If they're on opposite sides, that's trans. Most natural unsaturated triglycerides have cis double bonds. The chains kink. They don't pack so nicely as chains without any double bonds at all. And that raises their melting point. So these tend to be liquids, like olive oil. Monounsaturated fats from plants typically have just one double bond, it's cis, and they're not particularly bad for you if used correctly. However, there's a dark relative of cis double bonds in foods, and that is a trans double bond. Trans double bonds in triglycerides are not very common. So how do they come about in processed vegetable oils and fats? When a food manufacturer contains oils from seeds, they typically contain several cis double bonds. That is not good because these polyunsaturated triglycerides have a poor shelf life. They oxidize, they go rancid. They can't be stored for long periods in warehouses. They decompose in the air. A food manufacturer then might wish to take a cheap, readily available vegetable oil from a GMO crop, extract the oil from the seeds, and then convert these double bonds to saturated chains with no double bonds. Remember, the saturated chains pack very nicely together. That depresses the melting point of the fat and it becomes solid at room temperature. Solid fats are desirable for certain applications. I've shown this hydrogenation process here, but hydrogenation is just one step in processing of vegetable oils. The seeds are obtained, as I say, typically from a GMO crop. They are crushed to break the husks, and then they're squeezed. This squeezes out most of the oil, but leaves some behind in the solid residue. And that residue is typically called the meal. So the oil, which is filtered off, is saved, and then the meal is processed some more. The manufacturers want all the oil they can from the meal, so they will wash it with hexane. Hexane is a component of gasoline. The hexane will dissolve triglycerides because hexane is lipophilic, so are triglycerides. They will be extracted from the meal, and then the manufacturer will take the hexane solution and distill off most of the hexane. But unfortunately, a little bit of hydrocarbon residue may be left. And that's unfortunate. You don't want to be eating that. During and after the distillation, the oils may be heated. The processing of vegetable oils is brutal, 400 degrees C perhaps. Heating a triglyceride to 400 degrees C is asking for trouble. It will change chemically. After this process, the oil has lost all its flavor, really, and it may look nasty and smell bad. So it can be bleached. Bleaching takes out some of the colored impurities. This leaves a substance that doesn't smell so bad, but by this stage, most of the nutrients have been washed out or decomposed. Finally, the combined oils are purified in many other steps to give the end product a processed oil. But there's a problem. How can we get rid of those double bonds? And the answer is chemically reduce them with hydrogen over a catalyst. This adds hydrogen molecules across the double bond and saturates the chains. On paper, this looks good. In practice, it's a disaster because hydrogenation rarely goes 100%. One of the impurities formed is trans fats. Trans fats are extremely bad for you. A good example of a partially hydrogenated processed triglyceride is margarine. Margarine is very bad for you. I will never eat margarine consciously again. Trans fats unambiguously cause heart disease, atherosclerosis, hardening and swelling of the arteries around the heart. The evidence has been in the literature for this since the 1990s, and it grew stronger and stronger. And then some countries, particularly in Europe, banned trans fats in the early 2000s. But it took a while in the United States. In 2015, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, started issuing warnings So in 2015, the FDA issued this warning: removing partially hydrogenated oils, PHOs, from processed foods is estimated to save several thousand heart attacks and deaths per year. But trans fat byproducts are still in processed foods. For instance, foods processed for shortening in pastries. They're still in processed vegetable oils. Corn oil is very bad. These oils have to be hydrogenated, supposedly fully, and processed to have a long shelf life. At the bottom of the list are more natural monounsaturated or saturated oils. Coconut oil, for instance, very healthy. It's mostly saturated. Butter is almost as good. Lard from animals, quite a healthy source of fats. Why do people still cook with corn oil, granola oil, oils like these? Well, they simply don't know where they come from, and they're cheaper. It's easy to grab a liquid oil from the shelf and fry in that, or put these into ultra-processed foods in a manufacturing process. Okay, let's say you go into a supermarket, you're very concerned about trans fats. What is the legislation in the United States? Simply to bear the label 0% trans fats requires that the food contains less than 0.5 grams per serving. But Wikipedia, for instance, cites sources that point out quite rightly that most consumers couldn't really know what that means. So let's compare. In Europe, products from genetically modified crops are not allowed in human food. Their dietary guidelines say that there can be no more than 2 grams of trans fatty acids per 100 grams in a food. That is a law, not a guideline for a label. Okay, so how does 0.5 grams per serving compare with 2 grams in 100 grams? For that, you have to have a calculator. You have to do a little bit of research. And one of the first things you have to know is, how big is the serving? Secondly, you have to know, what is the density of the oil? So in one serving, you can calculate from the density how many grams of oil is one serving. And then, of course, you have to normalize that to 100 grams. So you take 100 grams and you divide it by however many servings you can get in 100 grams, and there's your answer. I've been through this process. If I didn't make any mistakes, I reckon that's in the US, to get this label, 0% trans fats, you can have no more than 3.6 grams. That, to me, is a lot. That means 3% of the oil in the container can be trans fats, just to get the 0% trans fat label. In Europe, you're not allowed to sell more than 2 grams in 100 grams of food. And of course, because genetically modified crops are not allowed in food in Europe, then there's less supply in the first place. You may be alarmed. You should be alarmed, I think. If you go to a supermarket and you look at the ingredients of a processed food, you should be concerned. Does this contain vegetable oils? And if you're particularly concerned about trans fats, then you might look for the nutrition facts, and it might say 0% trans fats, but that doesn't mean no trans fats. A more reliable guide is simply to look at the ingredients. If the ingredients contain a processed vegetable oil, corn, soy, canola, those types of things, then personally, I don't eat it these days. People who do eat them have a risk of dying from heart attack caused by trans fats. But that's not the only bad thing about processed vegetable oils. There's even worse news, and it's not so widely known. I plan to talk about them in other videos. I love these 3 books. The first one, Deep Nutrition, from a family practice doctor in the United States who began her career as a molecular biologist at Cornell. She really delves deeply into this subject. That was published in 2017. Since then, there's been another really good book, Ultra-Processed People. It talks about the way food in general is processed, and particularly vegetable oils. Finally, the author of Deep Nutrition has written a second book, and it's similar to the first in some ways, but she's refined her arguments very sharply. These three books will frighten you about food that you may be eating if they're ultra-processed foods or contain processed vegetable oils. I strongly recommend these three books. Links are in the information below. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye, and enjoy your dinner.